How's it going today, guys? In today's episode, I'm going to be talking with ChatGPT about the cemeteries here in Puerto Rico. So I asked ChatGPT the question. So I've been thinking about the cemeteries in Puerto Rico, and I've been wondering why they are the way they are. Why the above ground concrete tombs? Is it practical, or is it because of the Catholic Spanish influence? And I got a pretty good reply from ChatGPT.
It's both practical first and then shaped and reinforced by Spanish Catholic tradition. The look of Puerto Rican cemeteries is the result of environment, law, culture, and theology layering on top of each other over centuries. Here's how it fits together. 1. The practical reason, the foundation of everything. Puerto Rico's climate and geography make underground burial very difficult in many places. High water table. Large parts of Puerto Rico sit on porous limestone karst, and groundwater is often very close to the surface. If you dig a grave deep enough, it can flood, especially during heavy rains and hurricanes. That makes traditional in-ground burial messy, unstable, and sometimes impossible. Heavy rainfall and tropical storms. Frequent flooding can unearth or disturb shallow graves. Above-ground tombs avoid this problem entirely. Heat and decomposition. In a tropical climate, bodies decompose very quickly. Above-ground concrete vaults contain remains in a controlled sealed space rather than letting them interact with soil, insects, or water. So even without religion, many tropical and flood-prone places around the world independently developed above-ground burial systems. You see variations of this in parts of the Caribbean, coastal Latin America, and even in places like New Orleans. If Puerto Rico had never been Catholic, you would still likely have seen some form of raised or enclosed burial system, simply because the land and climate push people in that direction. 2. The Spanish Catholic influence, what shaped the style. While practicality explains why burial is above ground, Catholic Spanish tradition explains why it looks the way it does. Under Spanish rule, Puerto Rico inherited Iberian Spanish burial customs that had already been influenced by ancient Roman practices, medieval Christian traditions, Moorish Islamic architectural influence in Spain. This produced a very specific idea of what a cemetery should be. The cemetery as a sacred city of the dead. Spanish Catholic cemeteries were designed almost like small walled towns, with organized rows like streets, family niches, or mausoleums instead of individual graves, a central cross or chapel. Puerto Rican cemeteries follow this model very closely. Concrete and masonry as permanent and dignified. In Catholic theology, the body is sacred even after death because of the belief in resurrection. Permanent stone or concrete tombs reflect that idea of dignity and respect. Family crypts, not individual graves. Spanish tradition emphasized family burial together over generations. That's why in Puerto Rico you often see multi-level vaults, family names engraved, tombs reused over time, remains moved to make space. Number 3, how the two came together in Puerto Rico. You can think of it like this. Nature decided the basic format, above ground. Spanish Catholic culture designed the aesthetic, concrete, organized, ornate, communal, sacred. That's why Puerto Rican cemeteries look different from mainland U.S. cemeteries, usually grassy, underground burials, indigenous Caribbean burial sites, which were often mounds, caves, or natural spaces. Northern European cemeteries, older, more spread out, less structured. Number 4, one more key layer, urban space. In many Puerto Rican towns, cemeteries were built right next to the church and plaza. That reflects a very Spanish Catholic worldview where life, death, and community are physically connected. The dead remain part of the town rather than being pushed far away. That's why walking through a Puerto Rican cemetery often feels more like walking through a neighborhood than a graveyard.
Very interesting. But I feel that the Spanish Catholic tradition has had a lot more influence on the cemeteries than meets the eye. What were the cemeteries here in Puerto Rico like before the Spanish arrived onto the island? Surely they weren't using concrete above ground tombs in the 1200s, the 1300s, the 1400s, and so on and so forth.
You're right. Before the Spanish, the burial landscape in Puerto Rico looked completely different. And you're also right that there were no concrete above ground tombs in the 1300s or 1400s. What existed instead reflected Taino indigenous beliefs, the natural environment, and a very different relationship to death. Here is what we actually know from archaeology, oral history, and early Spanish accounts. 1R1. Who was burying people before the Spanish? Before 1493, Puerto Rico, Boricua, was inhabited primarily by the Taino people, part of the larger Arawak-speaking Caribbean world. Their spiritual worldview, social structure, and burial customs were nothing like Spanish Catholic ones. So whatever cemeteries existed were Taino spaces, not European-style graveyards. Not two. There were no formal cemeteries like today. The Taino did not build centralized, walled cemeteries with organized rows of graves the way the Spanish later did. Instead, burial was more dispersed and site-specific, often tied to villages, sacred landscapes, caves, family or community ritual spaces. Death was integrated into their environment rather than separated into a dedicated municipal cemetery. How the Taino buried their dead. There were three main burial forms found in Puerto Rico and across the Taino world. A. Cave burials, very important. This is the most well-documented pre-Spanish burial practice in Puerto Rico. Many Taino remains have been found in caves across the island. Caves were considered sacred portals between worlds. Bodies were often placed in a fetal position, laid on their side, sometimes wrapped or accompanied by offerings. Caves were not just random places. They were spiritual landscapes associated with ancestors and deities. B. Some Taino burials occurred near or within village spaces, bateys, ceremonial plazas, or near bohíos houses. These were usually shallow, in-ground burials, sometimes marked with stones, shells, or wooden markers, which don't survive archaeologically. There was no masonry, no concrete, no vaults, and no tomb structures. C. Burial mounds, less common in Puerto Rico, more in other Caribbean islands. In parts of the Greater Antilles, indigenous peoples created small earthen burial mounds. Evidence of this in Puerto Rico is more limited than in places like Hispaniola, but the practice existed in the broader Taino world. Again, these were earth-based, not above-ground built structures. Number 4. The spiritual meaning of Taino burial. This is where influence really differs. This is where things diverge most sharply from Spanish Catholic tradition. For the Taino, death was not an end, but a transition. Ancestors remained spiritually present. Caves and natural landscapes were sacred, not just burial sites. There was no concept of a city of the dead, no rigid organization of graves, and no emphasis on permanent stone tombs. The focus was relationship with the land and the spirit world, not physical monumentality. 5. What changed with the Spanish arrival? When the Spanish arrived in 1493, they gradually replaced indigenous burial traditions with Catholic ones through forced conversion, destruction or abandonment of Taino sacred sites, creation of church-centered towns with attached cemeteries. Over time, cave burials declined, village earth burials were discouraged or banned, centralized cemeteries next to churches became the norm. The above-ground concrete tombs you see today are a much later development, largely 18th, 20th century, blending tropical environmental necessity, Spanish Catholic urban planning, Caribbean masonry traditions.
I would like to delve more into the Catholic aspect of the cemeteries here in Puerto Rico specifically. So, what I'm looking for is just a more in depth explanation for the cemeteries here in Puerto Rico as it pertains to the Catholic influence and tradition.
Below is a deeper look at Catholic views of burial as they are lived out in Puerto Rico cemeteries, not just as doctrine, but as practice, ritual, and everyday relationship with the dead. Image 1. The body is sacred, not disposable. In Catholic theology, the human body is not just a vessel for the soul. It is created by God and destined for resurrection. Key belief, open quote, at the end of time there will be a bodily resurrection, close quote. Because of this, Catholic burial traditionally treats the body with great reverence. In Puerto Rico, the solid, enclosed concrete tomb reflects this idea in a very physical way. The body is protected, not abandoned to the elements. The sealed tomb suggests rest, dignity, and waiting, rather than disappearance. Burial is not about discarding remains, but guarding them until resurrection. This is one reason cremation was historically discouraged, though it is now permitted under certain conditions. The cemeteries visually express this theology. The dead are not hidden, they are enshrined. Number 2, cemetery as sacred ground, not just a graveyard. In Catholic understanding, a cemetery is consecrated ground, meaning it is blessed and set apart for holy use. In Puerto Rico, you can see this in the layout and feel of many cemeteries. Central crosses or crucifixes, small chapels within the cemetery, stations of the cross in some older sites, religious imagery everywhere, angels, saints, Virgin Mary, Christ. The cemetery functions almost like an open-air extension of the church. This shapes how people behave there. People pray at graves. They light candles. They make the sign of the cross when passing. They speak to their deceased relatives as if they are still spiritually present. The space is not purely mournful, it is liturgical and relational. Number 3, communion of saints. The dead are still with us. A core Catholic teaching is the communion of saints. The living and the dead are spiritually connected. In Puerto Rican cemeteries, this belief becomes very tangible. Why families decorate tombs? Flowers, photos, candles, rosaries, statues, and even painted images reflect the idea that the dead are still part of the family. They can intercede in prayer. They are still loved, remembered, and visited. The cemetery becomes a place of ongoing relationship, not just final separation. This is why cemeteries in Puerto Rico often feel less cold or distant, more like a living memorial space. People don't just bury their relatives, they continue to care for them. Number 4, purgatory and prayers for the dead. Catholic teaching includes belief in purgatory, a state of purification before entering heaven. Because of this, families pray for the souls of their deceased loved ones. Lighting candles at graves is seen as an act of intercession. Visiting the cemetery can be a spiritual duty, not just remembrance. In Puerto Rico, you'll often see candles burning at tombs, handwritten prayers left behind, people quietly praying at graves. The cemetery becomes a place of spiritual aid, not just mourning. Number 5, the tomb as a house of rest. Catholic language often refers to death as falling asleep in Christ. Puerto Rican concrete tombs visually mirror this idea. They look like small chambers or homes. They are enclosed, orderly, and permanent. Many are carefully maintained and painted, almost like keeping a loved one's room intact. This contrasts sharply with flat, grass-covered graves common in the mainland U.S. Catholic tradition. In Puerto Rico, the dead are not lost beneath the ground. They are resting above it, visibly and securely. Number 6, public faith versus private grief. In many parts of the U.S., grief is often private and subdued. In Puerto Rico, Catholic burial culture allows grief to be open, visible, and communal. You'll notice tombs are not uniform. They reflect personality and devotion. Families return frequently, not just on anniversaries. All Souls Day, Dia de los Fieles Difuntos, is widely observed with cemetery visits. Faith is not hidden, it is inscribed into the cemetery itself. Number 7, why this matters for the above-ground tombs. Putting it all together, Catholic belief in Puerto Rico supports above-ground tombs because they align with reverence for the body, permanence over erasure, visibility of faith, ongoing relationship between living and dead, protection and dignity of remains, sacred rather than purely practical use of space. The concrete tomb becomes both a theological symbol and a physical reality.
When I'm walking around the cemeteries in Puerto Rico, I notice that some people actually are buried in the ground with just a concrete cross marker and no name, while others are buried in tombs with beautiful statues. Let's delve into the wealth disparity as it pertains to the cemeteries in Puerto Rico.
Number 1, the basic visual contrast you're noticing. At the most obvious level, you're seeing two very different kinds of burial. A, ground burials with simple concrete crosses, typically less wealth. These often represent working class or poorer families, people with fewer financial resources, older graves where families may no longer be able to maintain them. Common features: a plain concrete or stone cross, minimal decoration, sometimes weathered, cracked, or overgrown, often clustered together in less prestigious sections of a cemetery. These graves communicate, open quote, "We buried our loved one with dignity, but with limited means," close quote. Above ground tombs, niches, or mausoleums, typically more wealth. These usually reflect middle to upper class families who could afford construction, maintenance, and decoration. You'll often see larger structures, sculpted statues, angels, Mary, Christ, etc., engraved marble or stone plaques, family names prominently displayed, regular repainting and upkeep. These tombs communicate, open quote, "We have the resources to create something permanent, visible, and monumental," close quote. Number 2, cemeteries as a map of social class. If you walk slowly through many older Puerto Rican cemeteries, you can literally read class divisions in space. Typically, you'll find prestige zones of the cemetery. These often include central areas, sections near chapels or main entrances, rows with large family mausoleums. Historically, wealthier families bought the best burial plots, built more elaborate structures, created tombs that would last generations. Death, in this sense, became another way to display social status. Marginal zones. These are often at the edges of the cemetery, in lower lying or less desirable land, more crowded or chaotic sections. Here you're more likely to see simple ground burials, deteriorating markers, graves that look forgotten or abandoned. So even in death, social hierarchy remains spatially organized. Number 3, who could afford above ground tombs? Building a concrete tomb or mausoleum requires land purchase, construction costs, ongoing maintenance, sometimes permits or cemetery fees. Historically, this meant landowning families, merchants, professionals, doctors, lawyers, officials, politically connected families. Working class or rural families often could not afford this, so they relied on simpler burials, communal or municipal plots, basic concrete crosses rather than enclosed vaults. So the cemetery becomes a material record of economic history. Number 4, family continuity versus economic fragility. A key difference you'll notice: wealthier families equals long-term presence. When a family has money, tombs are maintained across generations, names remain visible, graves are repainted, repaired, and visited. The family legacy remains physically present in the cemetery. The tomb becomes a kind of permanent family monument. Poorer families more likely to disappear over time. When a family lacks resources, graves may fall into disrepair. Markers can crack, fade, or be lost. Future generations may move away or lose connection. Eventually, the grave may blend into the landscape. So cemeteries don't just reflect inequality, they preserve it over time. Number 5, religion plus wealth. Who gets the beautiful imagery? You'll often see that the most elaborate religious imagery, angels, Virgin Mary statues, carved crosses, tends to appear on wealthier tombs. This doesn't mean poorer families were less religious. It means art costs money, marble costs money, sculptures cost money, skilled labor costs money. So Catholic devotion becomes aestheticized through wealth. Poorer graves might still have small crosses, handwritten prayers, simple religious symbols, but they rarely have the grand sculptural displays. Number 6, public versus private responsibility. Another layer people miss. Wealthier families equals private responsibility. They pay for construction, maintenance, cleaning, repairs after storms. Their tombs are largely self-sustained. Poorer burials, more dependent on the municipality. Many simpler graves fall under municipal cemetery upkeep, limited public maintenance, minimal restoration after hurricanes or flooding. This means poorer graves are more vulnerable to weather damage, neglect, slow erasure. Number 7, hurricanes as an equalizer, but not really. You might think, well, storms affect everyone equally, but in reality, wealthier families can repair or rebuild after damage, poorer families often cannot. After major hurricanes, you can sometimes see cracked, simple graves left unrepaired, but well-off mausoleums quickly restored. So natural disasters often widen rather than erase cemetery inequality. Number 8, what this says about Puerto Rican society. If we step back, Puerto Rican cemeteries reveal a history of economic stratification, the persistence of family status across generations, the link between money and memory, The way class shapes even how we are remembered after death. In a sense, cemeteries are a quiet archive of inequality. Number 9, a deeper philosophical question, if you want to go there. Your observation raises a powerful question. Open quote, does wealth determine whose memory is preserved? Close quote. In Puerto Rico's cemeteries, the answer often appears to be partly yes. Some people are remembered in marble and statues. Others are remembered only by a weathered cross, or eventually not at all.